The advertisement had been for a wife. Plain, sturdy, and willing to work. Adam Sterling had written the words himself, his hand stiff and unfamiliar with the pen, the ink bleeding slightly on the cheap paper. He'd sent it with a freight driver to the territorial newspaper in Cheyenne, along with $2 silver he could not spare. He expected a woman named Mary, from a worn-out farm in Ohio, whose letters were as plain and practical as his advertisement. He had imagined her with wide shoulders and hands already calloused. He had not imagined this. The stagecoach kicked up a cloud of Wyoming dust that settled on everything, coating the clapboard front of the general store and the 3 horses tied to the hitching post. When the door swung open, a man in a dusty suit stepped out, followed by a woman. But she was not Mary from Ohio. She was small, fine-boned, and her face, framed by straight black hair, was a study in exhausted stillness. She wore a light pink prairie dress, the fabric faded from too many washings and too much sun, the color of a sunset that had given up. She clutched a single, small carpet bag. She looked around the dusty street of Redemption Creek, her eyes scanning the handful of faces that had turned to watch the stage arrive. Her gaze finally settled on Adam, the tallest man there, his worn work clothes marking him as the one who lived furthest from the town's meager comforts. She took a hesitant step forward, the dust puffing up around the hem of her worn boots. He met her halfway, his own boots heavy on the dry ground. He was a man built of long lines and quiet intentions, his face weathered by the sun and a solitude he had not chosen but had inherited along with the ranch. He stopped a few feet from her, unsure what to say. The entire town was watching. Mr. Henderson, the store owner, was already polishing the front window with a rag, his movement slow and deliberate, missing nothing. The woman swallowed, her throat working. Her voice, when it came, was soft, a mere whisper against the vast silence of the prairie. "My father said you needed a wife." The words hung in the hot summer air. They were not the words of Mary from Ohio. Adam's mind raced. There had to be a mistake. A terrible, public mistake. He had Mary's last letter in his pocket, the paper softened with sweat. It said she would be on this stage. "I was expecting someone else," he said, his voice rough from disuse. Her dark eyes held his, and for the first time, he saw the fear in them, deep and profound. But beneath it was a spine of pure steel. "My name is Mai," she said, her English careful and precise. "My father is Mr. Chen." He made an arrangement. Adam had never heard the name. An arrangement? His arrangement was with a woman from Ohio. He felt the weight of every stare from the boardwalk. To send her back now, on the same stage, would be a cruelty he couldn't stomach. The next town was a full day's ride. But to take her to his ranch, the thought was impossible. The whispers would follow him for years. He was already an outsider, a man who kept to himself on a piece of land most considered cursed by drought and bad luck. The arrangement was for a woman named Mary, he stated, keeping his voice low. "Mary is my American name," she replied, the lie clumsy and immediate. He knew it was a lie. She knew he knew. But it was a shield, offered in desperation. She held her ground, her small frame braced against the enormity of her situation. Therefore, he was left with a choice that was no choice at all. He could humiliate her and leave her stranded, or he could accept this impossible situation and deal with the consequences. He looked past her, at the smirking face of a ranch hand from the big double horn spread, and his decision hardened. He would not give them the satisfaction. "All right then," he said, the words feeling like stones in his mouth. He reached down and took the carpet bag from her hand. It was lighter than he expected, as if it held nothing more than air and hope. "My wagon's over here." He turned and walked away, not waiting to see if she followed. He heard the soft crunch of her boots in the dust behind him. He did not look at Mr. Henderson, or at the ranch hands, or at the stagecoach driver who was already unloading a crate of supplies. He just loaded her bag onto the back of his buckboard wagon and untied the reins of his 2 sturdy mules. He helped her up onto the seat, his hand briefly touching hers. Her skin was cool, despite the heat. The ride out to his homestead was silent. The land stretched out on all sides, a vast, sun-baked canvas of brown grass and pale sky. His ranch was 5 miles out of town, 5 miles of rattling wheels and the rhythmic plodding of the mules. It was a poor spread, a quarter section he'd claimed under the Homestead Act, with a small cabin he'd built with his own 2 hands, a barn that leaned slightly to the north, and a well that was his most prized and precarious possession. He did not know what to say to the woman beside him. Every question that came to mind felt like an accusation. Who was she? Why was she really here? What had happened to the real Mary? But he held his tongue. The silence felt safer. When they finally crested the last rise, the cabin came into view. It was a simple, stark building of cartonwood logs, chinked with mud and straw. A thin curl of smoke rose from the stone chimney, the last of his morning cook fire. It was a lonely sight. He saw it through her eyes for the first time, not as a home he had built, but as a box of rough-hewn wood dropped in the middle of nowhere. He pulled the wagon to a halt near the front porch. "This is it," he said. Mai looked at the cabin, then at the endless, empty land surrounding it. Her face was unreadable. She said nothing, simply waiting for him to help her down. He did, and she stood for a moment, her pink dress a strange splash of color against the muted landscape. He took her bag and led her inside. The cabin was one room. A stone fireplace dominated one wall. A rough-hewn table with 2 chairs sat in the middle. His cot was in one corner, a small cooking area in another. It was clean, brutally functional, and entirely masculine. There was no place for her. He saw the stark reality of it in the way her gaze swept the room and found no purchase. "You can have the cot," he said gruffly. "I'll sleep in the barn." She finally looked at him, her expression shifting. It was not gratitude he saw, but a quiet assessment. "Thank you," she whispered. That night, as he lay on a pile of hay in the barn, the scent of dried grass and mule all around him, Adam Sterling felt the full weight of his decision. He had a stranger in his house, a woman from a world he could not comprehend, and a town full of gossips waiting for him to fail. He did not yet know that the woman in the faded pink dress held the key not just to his survival, but to the truth of his own father's past. The days that followed were a study in quiet awkwardness. Mai was a tireless worker, but not in the way he had expected from the fictional Mary. She did not know how to milk his 1 cow, mend a fence, or handle the livestock. Instead, she moved with a silent, observant grace, cleaning the cabin until the rough floorboard shone, tending a small garden she started with seeds she'd carried in her bag, and preparing meals from their meager supplies that were surprisingly flavorful. She was always busy, her hands always moving, as if stillness was a danger she could not afford. They barely spoke. Their conversations were limited to the necessities of the day. "The water barrel is low," or "I will be back from the north pasture before sundown." He found himself watching her, trying to understand the person behind the careful silence. He noticed the way she studied things, her head tilted, her eyes narrowed in intense concentration. She would watch him repair a piece of tag for an hour without a word, her gaze following the movement of his hands as he worked the leather. The town did not forget them. When Adam rode in for supplies the following week, Mr. Henderson was full of questions disguised as pleasantries. "Getting settled in with your new wife?" he asked, leaning on the counter. "We're managing," Adam said, his jaw tight. "Folks are talking, Adam. A woman like that, it ain't natural." "Where's she from?" "Ohio," Adam lied, the word tasting like ash. He paid for his flour and salt pork, loaded his wagon, and left without another word. The lie was a flimsy wall, and he knew it wouldn't hold for long. The real crisis came 2 weeks later, at the height of the summer drought. The sky was a brassy, unforgiving bowl, and the earth was cracked and thirsty. Adam's well, which had always been reliable, began to falter. The hand pump, a heavy iron contraption, started to squeal in protest, and the water it brought up was thin and silty. Then, one morning, the handle went slack in his hand. He pumped and pumped, but nothing came. The silence from the well pipe was the sound of impending doom. Without water, his cattle would die. His garden would wither. He would lose the homestead. It was that simple. He spent the entire day trying to fix it, pulling up the long pipe section by section, his muscles screaming in protest under the brutal sun. He checked the leather gaskets, cleared the foot valve, and found nothing obviously broken. But when he reassembled it, the result was the same. A dry, hollow cough from the depths of the earth. Defeated, he slumped onto the porch steps as the sun began to set, his hands raw and his spirit scraped clean. He had failed. Everything his father had left him, everything he had worked for, was turning to dust. Mai came out of the cabin and stood before him. She held a cup of water, likely the last clean water they had. She offered it to him. He shook his head. "You drink it," he rasped. She didn't move. "What is wrong with the pump?" she asked. "It's broken," he said, the words flat with despair. "The sucker rod's not drawing. I think the cylinder's shot, deep down where I can't reach it. To replace it would mean a trip to Cheyenne and more money than he had." She looked at the well, then back at him. "May I see it?" He almost laughed. What could she possibly do? But the exhaustion was too deep for scorn. He just nodded, a weary, defeated gesture. She walked over to the well, her worn dress trailing in the dust. She didn't touch the handle. Instead, she knelt, her ear close to the iron casing of the pipe, and had him work the handle again. She listened, her eyes closed in concentration, like a doctor listening to a man's heart. She listened for a long time. Then she stood up and walked around the pump, examining the bolts, the joints, the place where the pipe went into the ground. Her brow was furrowed. "It is not the cylinder," she said finally, her voice certain. "It is a pressure lock. An air bubble, trapped in the downpipe. The gaskets are old. They let air in when you pulled the pipe, but they will not let it out." Adam stared at her. He'd been a rancher his whole life. He knew wells. He'd never heard of a pressure lock. "That's not possible." "My father worked for the railroad," she said, meeting his gaze. "He designed steam engines. They are all just pumps and pressure. I watched him." She looked around, her eye scanning the yard. She pointed to the trough where he watered the mules. "We need to pour water down the top of the pipe. A lot of it, all at once. It will force the air bubble down and out through the foot valve. It will prime the pump again." It sounded like foolishness. Wasting the last of their water on a guess. But he looked at the certainty in her eyes, the focused intelligence that had been hiding behind her silence all this time. He had tried everything he knew. His way had led to failure. "All right," he said, getting to his feet. "We'll try your way." It took them nearly an hour. They used every drop of water they had left, from the barrel in the kitchen to the canteens in his saddlebags. They poured it down the top of the pipe while he worked the handle in a specific rhythm she instructed, a short, sharp downstroke. For a long time, nothing happened. The last of the water vanished into the dry pipe. Adam's heart sank. It was over. Then, he felt a slight resistance in the handle. A gurgle echoed from deep in the well. Again, Mai urged, her voice tense. He put his whole body into it, pumping with a desperate energy. The gurgle grew louder, followed by a sucking sound. The handle kicked back, suddenly heavy with weight. He gave one more heave, and with a shudder and a groan, a stream of muddy water spewed from the spout, followed by a clear, cool, beautiful rush. Adam stood there, stunned, as the water splashed into the dust. He let go of the handle and turned to look at Mai. She was watching the water, a small, weary smile on her face. In that moment, she was not a fragile stranger in a pink dress. She was the woman who had saved his ranch. But their relief was short-lived. A rider had crested the hill, his horse kicking up a plume of dust. The man rode with an easy arrogance, his expensive saddle and fine horse marking him as a man of means. It was Marcus Brenner, owner of the Double Horn, the largest and most powerful ranch in the territory. Brenner controlled a creek that fed the whole valley, and he was notoriously stingy with his water rights. Brenner reined in his horse a few yards away, his gaze taking in the scene, Adam, covered in grime and sweat, my standing beside him, and the miraculous flow of water from the well. A slow, unpleasant smile spread across Brenner's face. "Having some trouble, Sterling," he called out, his voice smooth as oiled leather. He didn't wait for an answer. His eyes fixed on my. "I see you found yourself some interesting help. Didn't take you for a man with such exotic tastes." Adam stepped slightly in front of my. "What do you want, Brenner?" Brenner's smile didn't waver. "Just making a neighborly visit. Heard you had a new arrival. Wanted to see for myself." His eyes lingered on my, a cold, appraising look that made Adam's hands curl into fists. A man with a new wife and a working well in the middle of a drought. "You're a lucky man. For now." He tipped his hat, a gesture that was more of a threat than a courtesy, and rode away. The dust settled, but a new kind of tension remained, thicker and more dangerous than the heat. What Adam couldn't know was that Brenner wasn't just interested in his water, he was interested in the woman who had just fixed his well. That night, the air in the cabin was different. The barrier of silence between them had been broken by the shared crisis and the shared victory. After a simple meal of beans and jerky, Adam found he could not return to the pretense of distance. He sat at the table, watching my clean the single skillet they owned. "Thank you," he said. The words felt inadequate. "You saved everything today." She paused, her back to him. "My father taught me to see how things fit together. Gears. Levers. Pipes. People are more complicated." She turned to face him, drying her hands on a cloth. Her face was serious in the flickering lamplight. "We need to talk. About why I am here." Adam nodded slowly. He had known this was coming. He had been a coward for not asking sooner. "The letters," he said. "From Mary." "I have them," she said. She went to her small carpet bag and retrieved a tied bundle of envelopes. She laid them on the table. "The handwriting is not mine." She then pulled out a single, separate piece of paper, folded many times. It was covered in dense Chinese characters on one side, and on the other, a block of precise, careful English script. "This is from my father. He said to give it to you only if I believed you were an honorable man." Adam looked at her, at the trust she was placing in him, and felt a profound sense of responsibility settle over him. "I'll listen," he said. He picked up the letter. The English was formal, the handwriting of a man who had learned the language from books. It told a story that made the blood run cold in his veins. Mai's father, Chen, was a brilliant engineer who had helped survey and design a difficult stretch of the Union Pacific Line through the mountains. When the work was done, he had saved enough to open a small but successful laundry and bathhouse in a railroad town east of Cheyenne. But he had fallen into debt. Not through gambling or drink, but through a string of bad luck and a business partner who had cheated him. The man who held his debt was Marcus Brenner. Brenner didn't want the failing business. He had seen Mai. He had offered to cancel the debt in exchange for her. It was not a proposal of marriage, but of ownership. Chen, trapped and desperate, had seemingly agreed. But he had a secret of his own. Years ago, before Adam was born, his own father, a freighter at the time, had been stranded in a blizzard near Chen's camp. Chen had taken him in, shared his food, and saved his life. Adam's father had sworn a debt of honor, a promise to repay the kindness if ever called upon. Chen was calling in that debt. He had heard of Adam's advertisement for a wife through a friend who read the territorial papers. He saw a chance, a desperate gamble. He sent Mai to Adam, the son of the man who owed him his life, trusting that blood and honor ran deeper than a business transaction. He had forged the letters from Mary to make the arrangement seem legitimate until Mai could arrive safely. He was trusting Adam to protect her from Brenner. Adam finished the letter and looked up. The single room felt small, the lamplight casting long, dancing shadows. He finally understood the fear he'd seen in her eyes at the stagecoach stop. She hadn't just been a lost traveler, she had been a fugitive running toward a man she'd never met, a man who was her only hope. Brenner, Adam said, the name a curse on his tongue. He thinks you belong to him. He holds the deed to my father's business. He believes it is a bill of sale, Mai said, her voice trembling slightly for the first time. My father is old. He sent me away to be safe. He hoped you would be what your father was. A good man. A cold anger, slow and deep, began to burn in Adam's chest. It was an anger at Brenner for his predatory cruelty. But it was also an anger at his own father for never mentioning this debt, this connection to a world Adam knew nothing about. He now understood the whispers he'd heard as a boy about his father's long freighting trips, the periods of hardship that had finally broken his health. His father had carried his own secrets. Before he could speak, the sound of hoofbeats thundered into the yard. Not one rider this time, but several. Adam stood up, his hand instinctively going to the hunting rifle mounted over the fireplace. He glanced at Mai. Her face was pale, but her eyes were steady. A heavy fist pounded on the door. Sterling! I know you're in there. I've come for my property. It was Brenner's voice, thick with rage and whiskey. Adam moved to the door, his rifle held low. This is my home, Brenner. You're not welcome here. I have a contract. Brenner roared from the other side. Signed by her father. She's mine, and I aim to collect. She is my wife, Adam said, the words coming out before he had even thought them through. They were a lie, but in that moment, they felt more true than anything he had ever said. He looked at Mai, who stood near the fireplace, her hands clenched at her sides. He was making a promise, not just to Brenner, but to her. To the memory of his father. A piece of paper from a mail-order bride agency won't stand up to a legal deed, Sterling. Brenner shouted. I've got 2 men with me. We can do this the easy way, or we can do this the hard way. Adam knew he was no match for 3 armed men. A shootout would be suicide. He needed to think. He looked at the letter from Mai's father, still lying on the table. He remembered her words, my father taught me to see how things fit together. The deed, he said quietly to Mai. What does it look like? Standard territorial deed transfer, she whispered, her eyes wide with fear. For the business. My name is not on it. But there is a clause. An addendum my father was forced to sign. What does it say? That the debt is satisfied upon delivery of his most valuable asset to Mr. Brenner's keeping. Adam's mind raced. It was a slave clause, thinly veiled in legal language. But it was also specific. To Mr. Brenner's keeping, he repeated. He looked at Mai. You were never in his keeping. You came here. The contract is void. He can't claim delivery was ever made. It was a long shot, a flimsy argument against armed men. But it was all they had. He opened the door a crack. Brenner stood on the porch, flanked by 2 of his hard-faced ranch hands. You're trespassing, Brenner, Adam said, his voice level. And you're mistaken about your contract. It specifies delivery to you. She was never delivered to you. She came to me. The terms were not met. Brenner's face darkened. He was a man used to getting his way through force, not legal debate. You think that little trick of words is going to stop me? It will when the U.S. Marshal in Cheyenne hears about it, Adam said, bluffing. He hadn't spoken to a marshal in years. Attempting to enforce a debt contract that looks an awful lot like slavery, using armed force, that's a federal crime. You could lose the double horn. He saw a flicker of uncertainty in Brenner's eyes. The man was powerful, but he was not invincible. He was a bully who preyed on the weak and isolated. He had never expected resistance, let alone a legal argument from a man like Adam Sterling. Brenner hesitated, his rage warring with his caution. He looked from Adam's calm face to the rifle in his hands, then back again. Finally, with a snarl of frustration, he took a step back. This isn't over, Sterling, he spat. You and your little China doll. This valley isn't big enough for both of us. He turned and stormed off the porch, his men following him. They mounted their horses and galloped away into the darkness, leaving a cloud of dust and unresolved menace hanging in the air. Adam closed the door and leaned against it, the rifle suddenly heavy in his hands. He let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. He looked at Mai. She was staring at him, her expression a mixture of relief and awe. You were very brave, she said softly. I was terrified, he admitted. But you were right. It was about how the pieces fit together. He had stood his ground, not with violence, but with an idea she had given him. For the first time since she arrived, he felt like they were a team. A partnership? 3 months later, the first snows of winter were dusting the high peaks. The autumn rains had been kind, and the valley was slowly recovering from the long, dry summer. Adam's ranch looked different. The well, which Mai had serviced and reinforced, now fed a small irrigation ditch that she had designed, using her father's engineering principles. It watered a winter garden that was thriving with cabbages and hardy greens. The cattle were healthy, and he had even managed to buy 2 more heifers with the money he'd saved by not losing his herd. He had sent a letter to the U.S. Marshal in Cheyenne, detailing Brenner's actions. An investigation was underway, and while Brenner was still a threat, his power in the valley was diminished. Fear had been replaced by a watchful caution. Inside the cabin, a fire crackled in the hearth. The room was warmer, more lived in. Shelves now lined one wall, holding jars of preserved vegetables. A new, larger table sat in the center of the room, one Adam had built himself. He had even added a small room onto the back of the cabin, a private space for Mai. He watched her now as she sat at the table, reading a book he had bought her in town. She was no longer wearing the faded pink dress. It had been replaced by a practical, dark blue wool dress she had sewn herself. She had changed, but so had he. The solitude that had once defined him had been replaced by a quiet companionship that he had come to cherish more than he could say. Their marriage was still a fiction on paper, a shield against the world. But it had become something real in the small, shared moments of their lives, the way she handed him a cup of coffee in the morning without asking, the way he knew to bring her interesting rocks he found in the fields for her to study. They were 2 lonely people who had found a home in the space they had built together. He walked over to the table and sat down across from her. She looked up from her book, a small, genuine smile gracing her lips. It was a smile he had earned. The advertisement I wrote, he said, his voice quiet. It was for someone plain and sturdy. She tilted her head. And what did you get? He looked at her, at the intelligence in her dark eyes, the strength in her small hands, the unwavering spirit that had saved him in more ways than one. I got what I needed, he said. And it was the truest thing he had ever known. And that brings us to the end of this one. If you stayed with me all the way through, thank you. Stories like this one only get told because folks like you sit down and listen. If you liked what you heard, go ahead and hit that like button. And if you want more stories from the old frontier, subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Until then, take care of yourself, and thanks again for being here.